Well, today we're going to begin week one of our journey through Scripture. And remember, our goal is to look at the first 13 chapters of the book of Genesis. We may not make it that far, so I may have been a little too ambitious. So we'll at least try to look at 1 through 11, because that'd be a lovely goal. So just a word about context and big picture, and then we'll start in on Genesis 1 through 2. So it's important to remember that the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis sort of function as a kind of preface or prologue to the history of Israel, which is the substance of the Old Testament. And that preface or prologue really is important for two reasons. Reason number one, the prologue, Genesis 1 through 11, tells us that what's happening in and through the people of Israel is really not just about them, but it actually has something to do with God's plan for the whole creation. Okay, so we're not simply reading the story about a particular people who live in a particular geographical location because they're really interesting or something like that. We're being told that God has a purpose that he's working out through these people, a purpose that actually embraces the whole of creation. So we'll kind of get a sense of this as we go on. And the second purpose that the prologue has is to tell us why these people are actually necessary. That is, why is there a people of Israel? Well, there's a people of Israel because God's attempting to address a problem. And that problem, as we'll see in a minute, is the human rebellion against his purposes. Okay, so the people of Israel are actually addressing a need of humankind to be restored or reconciled to God. So the preface is really important in that sense because it's setting the context for the rest of the story. So with that said, let's take a look at the first two chapters of the book of Genesis. This is often called the creation account, so we're learning about creation here. And I think the thing that we just want to kind of begin with is this. If we jump into Genesis 1 through 2 and we begin by asking ourselves the question, okay, does this or does it not, support a modern cosmology, or does this or does this not support the theory of evolution? We will not only misunderstand these two chapters, we will actually be prevented from understanding them. Okay, so let's push that to the side for a minute, and let's think about how Genesis 1 through 2 might have been understood in its original context. It is the context of the ancient Near Eastern world, which is the context in which it was written. So probably, if you were someone from ancient Near Eastern culture, whether Babylonian or Egyptian or Israelite or whatever, you would sort of see Genesis 1 through 2 in the following way. It would be an account of the creation and consecration of the cosmos, the universe, as sort of a gigantic temple. That is, Genesis 1 through 2 says something really important about the nature of the universe. It doesn't tell us how it was made or the material constituents or about the laws that govern it. It's really not interested in that. That's a modern scientific perspective which is coming along later. Its fundamental interest is, what is creation? What is it? And the answer that it gives is, creation, the universe, is a temple. It is a space where God and his creatures meet. And you might know lots of other things about the universe that would be really interesting and really important, but if you don't know this one thing, then you don't understand it. Now, we're going to see how this is true in a number of ways as we move on, but let me just give you an example, I think, that confirms what I've just said. The book of Revelation ends, as you may remember, right, with the New Jerusalem coming out of heaven as a bride adorned for her husband. But we're told something really interesting about the New Jerusalem. The New Jerusalem lacks the central feature of the first Jerusalem. There's no temple in the New Jerusalem. And the reason why there's no temple in the New Jerusalem is because the whole universe has been restored to its status as a temple. So really important to kind of grasp that. So let's take a look at Genesis 1:1 through 2:4a. That's the first part of the story of creation. So what do we have here? Well, we have God who creates, as I said, the creation, the universe as a temple. And in the ancient world, temples had a number of functions. One of their functions was to house the image of the deity to whom the temple was dedicated. And we're told here that this temple, the temple that we call creation, actually does have the image of a deity in it. And guess what that image is? It's us. God creates human beings, male and female, in his own image and sets them in this temple. That is, our role, our vocation is in effect to reflect something of God's nature into his creation. That's our job. That's our role. That's our calling as human beings. We're not just sort of put here to sort of like live and have a nice time and then eventually die. Rather, our role in creation is to sort of be sort of like living representatives of God himself in this temple. So we want to keep that in mind. Now, I also learned something else about this temple that I think is also important, and that's this. Human beings aren't the apex of creation because remember, something happens on that seventh day. And of course, that seventh day is, as we learn, the creation of the Sabbath. That's the kind of the culmination of creation. And there's been a lot of attempt to interpret, well, what does that mean when we're told that God rests on the Sabbath? Well, I think we're given the answer in Psalm 132, verses 13 to 14. Here's what God says. This is my resting place forever. Here will I dwell, for I have desired it. That is, notice here what's happening. The rest that's being talked about here is not that God's worked really hard for 6 days and he's now exhausted and so he's going to sleep in on Saturday morning. That's not it. It's the rest not of exhaustion or of simply work completed. It's the rest of a monarch who is secure on his throne. It's the rest of a monarch who has no challengers, whose dominion over his creation is without question. Now, getting ahead a little bit, just to see how important this is, later on when we look at the book of Exodus, we'll see this pattern repeated. Moses is instructed to create this sort of thing called the tabernacle. And that tabernacle is erected in 7 stages. And the final stage, the thing that makes the tabernacle is that the cloud of the divine glory comes and enters into it. And that's what's happened here on the 7th day. What makes the universe a genuine temple? The fact that God's actually present in it. And we can actually meet him there. So really important stuff. Now, the second part of this creation story is Genesis 2:4b to 25. It seems a little different, but actually it's part of the first account. So here's I think the best way to think of it is, in Genesis 1, we're getting a kind of panoramic picture of creation. Now in Genesis 2, we're getting a more sort of up-close picture of creation. So the two accounts actually are intended to supplement one another. And both of them have something important to say. In the first creation account, God is transcendent. He's the one who speaks the whole universe into existence. In the second account, God actually appears within creation. That is, he's immanently present in it. And so the question is, well, is God transcendent of creation, or is he really present in creation? And the answer to that question is yes. Okay? On the other hand, we also learn something about us. On one hand, right in the first creation account, we learn that we've been put into the creation to be sort of images or representatives of God. In the second creation account, we learn something else about ourselves that's really important too, and that is we too are creatures. We're not supernatural beings, we're not gods, we are creatures made out of the dust of the earth. That's the Old Testament's way of talking about creaturely life. We are creatures, and we have no life that's actually independent of God. Okay? We were not created with the assumption that somehow we would somehow be like independent of God and operate apart from him. Rather, we're creatures who are dependent upon God. Now, the two parts of creation, right, making a really important point. And by the time that we get to the end of the first creation account, we learn what that point is, and that is, right, that creation is good. God pronounces not only that creation is good, he says that it's very good. And the idea I think that we might want to get here is, as God has put together this cosmic temple, God is sort of like looking upon it and says, in effect, yes, that's exactly the way I want it. Almost sort of like an artist, right, who's completed a lovely picture or composed a wonderful symphony and is now kind of listened to it and says, yes, that's it. That's exactly what I intended to create. So that's where we leave the first creation account. And that gets us to Genesis 3. Genesis 3 is asking a really important question. And it's a question we've all probably asked ourselves, right? Well, if creation is good, if it was made the way that God wanted it to make, why is this place such a doggone mess? Right? If creation was made good, why, as we look around ourselves, right, why are so many things just so messed up? What happened? Well, let's see if we can answer that question. I'm not going to read to you the whole of Genesis 3, but I will read part of it just for the sake of time, and then I want to say a few things about it. So here's how Genesis 3 begins. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. And here we might want to think of a number of synonyms for crafty. The serpent was more manipulative than any of the other creatures that God. The serpent was more deceptive than any of the creatures that God had made. All right, so keep that in mind. He said to the woman, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden?' And the woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat of the fruit of the tree in the garden.' But God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of that tree that's in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'Oh, you surely won't die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.'" So notice what happens here. The serpent comes to the woman, and actually we learn later that the man actually was simply standing there with her, so he's not off somewhere. So they're there together, and the serpent says, he begins by twisting what God said. He says, "Well, is it really true that God told you that you shouldn't eat from any of the trees of the garden?" And the woman said, "No, he didn't say that at all. He just said that we couldn't eat from the one that's in the middle of the garden. That's the one that's off limits. All the rest of them we can eat from." And then the serpent says, "Well, would you like me to tell you the real reason why God doesn't want you to eat of that tree, as opposed to the reason that he gave you? You see, he knows that the minute you eat from that tree, you will become exactly like him." Now, this phrase, knowing good and evil, is a Semitic expression. It doesn't just mean like knowing the difference between good and evil. It actually means much more than that. The phrase knowing good and evil here means determining what is good and what is evil. So notice what the serpent says. The serpent says, look, God's put you in this garden. I know he's kind of made you his image and you're supposed to represent him, but let me tell you, your real goal should be to run the place. It is within your capacity to be the determiners of good and evil. Not just, God's made you like lower level management. You guys belong up at the executive suite. And if you just eat that fruit, it could be yours. So that's the temptation. Well, of course, as we know, the story unfolds that they do eat. But something happens that's really interesting. As it should come as no surprise, right, that what the serpent said actually is not true. They don't become the determiners of good and evil at all. Something far worse happens. Here's what happens in Genesis 3:7. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. Now, once again, one of the things that's really interesting about the Hebrew language is Hebrew is a very sort of like inflected language. As words have like multiple meanings. And one of the meanings of the word here that's translated naked isn't just like naked in terms of like not having any clothes. Its most common meaning in the Old Testament is not unclothed, but vulnerable. They eat the fruit, and what happens is it's not they become like the determiners of good and evil. Rather, they become aware that they're vulnerable creatures. And as a way of sort of hiding this, they kind of adopt a sort of desperate and somewhat pathetic measure. They find some fig leaves and sew them together, and that's the birth of what we now know as the fashion industry. No surprise that the birth of the fashion industry and the beginning of sin go hand in hand, right? But notice this is a really important comment. Notice what's going on here. They become aware that they're vulnerable, and their response to this vulnerability is to try to simply like cover it up. Okay? It's sort of like, and you may have had this experience, where you're out playing baseball or softball, right? And someone hits the softball through somebody's living room window. And there arrives that moment where, okay, what are we going to do about it? Who's going to go to Mrs. Smith and tell her that we just broke her living room window? And inevitably, right, some kid's going to say, well, maybe they won't notice it. Maybe they just won't recognize that the window's broken and we'll be all right. This is in effect, this is the beginning of sin for Genesis 3. It's the recognition, right, that we're vulnerable creatures, but we don't want to acknowledge it. We want to pretend that we're not really creatures at all. And so we find ways to hide that from ourselves. And then something else happens. Actually, two important things happen as the chapter goes on. Two sort of symbolic things occur. And one of them, I think, is actually quite important because at the end of chapter 2, we're told this about the man and the woman. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Now, in Genesis 3, that relationship is radically disrupted. So when God learns that the man and the woman have done this, he says to the man, have you eaten of the tree that I told you not to eat of? And the man, being the courageous guy that he is, says, it's her fault. She made me. The woman that you gave me. It's her fault. It's your fault. I'm just like an innocent bystander. I was just standing here, minding my own business. And she said, here, eat this. And I said, yes, dear. And that's what happened. But notice what's happened here. And I think, once again, this is a really important thing, too. Notice here that the first consequence of sin is that the relationship between these two people, husband and wife, who are referred to as being one flesh, notice what's happened to them. Their relationship has literally been torn apart. And that's the message here. That is, one of the effects of sin is that it destroys even the most intimate of human relationships. And finally here, and this is the second symbolic action, the man and the woman are exiled from the garden. Not simply because they've broken a rule. That is, it's not that God says, now, you clearly saw the sign that was posted by that tree, okay? Visitors to the garden are kindly requested not to eat of the fruit of this tree. Violators will be prosecuted. It clearly says that on that sign, and now I'm going to prosecute you. No. Their exile from the garden is a sign that their relationship with God has been broken. That is, I think this is a really important point. Sin here is seen not just simply as, a series of sort of morally questionable actions. Sin here is seen as literally a cancer that's let loose in creation, and if it's allowed to go unchecked, it will decreate the world. It will rip everything apart. And so the question for God here, and this is getting a little ahead of the story, but it's important. The question here that we want to kind of think about, and it's actually part of the good news, is we learn that God refuses to allow his creation to be destroyed. God is so faithful to his creation, God is so faithful to us, that he refuses to allow our turning away from him and the cancer that we've let loose into creation. He refuses to allow that to run free, and resolves not only to check it, but also to finally undo it. And the story of that is actually the story of the whole Bible, from Old Testament and New Testament. Now, one way I kind of thinking about this is to move forward now and take a look at the story of Cain and Abel in 4:126. This is sort of like a vignette. So what happens essentially from chapters 4 through 11 is we get a sort of series of vignettes about what sin is like. Okay, it's not like a comprehensive explanation, but we get a series of sort of, think of them as sort of like portraits of what sin does and what it looks like. So portrait number 2 here is the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4:1 through 26. And remember, here's what happens. Remember, what happens is that Cain and Abel both bring a sacrifice to God, and Cain is kind of anxious about his sacrifice. He becomes sort of fixated on his brother Abel, and he comes to see his brother Abel, in effect, as a threat and even an enemy. And this leads to him murdering his brother. And God asks Cain, this is kind of a poignant scene. He says, well, Cain, where's your brother? I don't see him. What happened to him? And then God says, oh, the ground is crying out with your brother's blood. Your action has defiled my creation. You've taken an innocent life. And Cain's response to all this, I think, is really interesting. Once again, it's a picture of sin. It's that famous remark, we've sort of all heard it, right? Am I my brother's keeper? Well, why should I know where my brother is? I mean, am I like his parent or something? In effect, what Cain's saying here is, and this is another effect of sin, Cain basically refuses to accept the notion that people have moral obligations to one another. That is, in effect, right, what we see here in Cain is we see the effects of sin now being worked out. And one of the effects of that sin is, hey, I'm an individual, I'm in charge of my life, I'll do whatever I darn well want to do. If my brother gets in my way, I'll kill him, because he's in my way. I don't want people to be in my way. This sort of builds, there's like a crescendo till we get to 6:1, and there's a really important comment that's made in 6:1 that I want to just underline here for a minute. The earth was filled with violence. That's one of the products of sin. That is, notice what happens here, and this is sort of a good picture of sin. So we turn away from God. We realize that we're vulnerable creatures. We try to find ways to hide that vulnerability. Our relationship with God, our relationship with other people is broken. And creation descends deeper and deeper and deeper into a kind of violent chaos. And God looks upon the world and sees that the whole face of the earth has been filled with violence. It's the sign of human rebellion against him. Now, one final thing, and this is where we'll probably have to stop. This brings us to the story of the flood in Genesis 6:9 through 9:17. And I just want to say a couple things about the flood because I think we tend to misunderstand it. We tend, I think, to think of the flood, right, as sort of like a divine temper tantrum, right? We tend to think of the flood as, God sees the world, it's filled with violence, it's filled with disorder, the cancer of sin is sort of like spreading everywhere, and so God gets like really angry and says, I'll teach them, turn on the water, whoosh, they'll get drowned. Every time I read this, I think about I had a friend when I was a kid, I was probably like 4th or 5th grade, and you may remember, right, there was these really popular things called ant farms. There were like these glass boxes that you would fill with sand and then you could send away to get ants in the mail. Growing up in Texas, we thought this was like really funny because there were ants already everywhere. You didn't need to send off in the mail for them. And so, you'd put the ants in and they would like dig tunnels and you could see the tunnels, right? Well, I knew this one guy who was, I think, something of a sadist. He's probably like a psychotherapist now. But once the ants had like dug all their tunnels, he would take the whole ant farm and then like shake it, right? That is not what God's doing here. What is God doing here? What's going on? Well, I think the key here to thinking about what's going on in the flood is to think about something that 1 Peter 3 says about it. 1 Peter 3 presents the flood not as an act of destruction, but as an act of cleansing. God sees the growing threat to his creation. God sees the growing corruption of his creation by human sin and decides to cleanse it, to wash it, to repurify it. So we'll want to keep that image in mind. Now, in the midst of the flood, remember the rain comes down, Noah gets all the animals in the ark, more clean animals and unclean animals, and so there they are all in the ark. And then a really important thing occurs in Genesis 8:1 in the midst of all this. And it's this, it's one verse. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock in the ark. God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock in the ark. Now, this is not implying that God sort of goes through moments of sort of like, that God doesn't have like divine senior moments where he's, what am I doing? Oh yes, I'm the creator. Okay, good. Glad to know that. Rather, this is a sort of expression. Talk about God remembering something is talk about God looking upon someone or something with mercy and favor. So in 8:1, we're being told something really, really important, maybe the most important message of the whole flood story, and that's this. Creation will survive. Creation will be redeemed. Creation will be restored to its original purpose of flourishing, only because of God's mercy. In effect, the whole of creation hangs by one thread, and that's the thread of the divine mercy. And mercy here actually refers to something that's really concrete. Mercy here refers to God's refusal to let either us or his creation go, which is good news. In many ways, Genesis 8:1 is a proclamation of the gospel. God refuses to allow us and his creation to be let go. One final thing, and then we'll have to stop. There's a really important scene that occurs in Genesis 9:1 through 17. And once again, I'm not going to read it for the sake of time, but I do want to note it because it's so important. God does something really important and interesting with Noah. He renews the covenant with Noah. And it's really important to notice here. I'll just read part of it to you. So this is after the flood. Noah offers a sacrifice, and then we're told this. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon the birds of the heavens, upon everything that creeps in the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. As I gave you the green plants, I give you everything, but you shall not eat the flesh with its life, that is, its blood." Notice what's going on here. Notice that God actually repeats the blessing on Noah that he'd uttered for the man and the woman in Genesis 1. Be fruitful and multiply. That is, what we're being told here is something really important. God does not intend to go back on his purpose of blessing creation. Even though his creation has turned away from him, his intent to bless is still there. So here, let me leave you with this kind of important image. Here's one way to think about sin, and it's an unusual image, which is why I like it. You know, we tend to think of sin in terms of sort of like, moral mistakes and people doing bad things, and that's part of it. There's actually a more important dimension. Human sin is sort of ironic in this sense. Human sin, our turning away from God, actually is our constant refusal to allow God to bless us. Human sin, right, is our turning away from God, and we say, no, we don't want your blessing. We're going to do this on our own. We got this. We know how to run this world. We're doing such a bang-up job. Can't you see? Notice here, Genesis is making, I think, a really interesting comment. That is, our sinfulness has a number of really tragic aspects to it. One tragic aspect of sin is what it leads us to do to ourselves and what it leads us to do to one another. That's one dimension, but there's an even worse dimension. Sin is our turning away from the divine blessing and our refusal to receive it. And the good news here is God saying, oh, no. You will receive my blessing. I refuse to allow you to be not blessed. Just wait and see how all this turns out. Okay? So these first couple chapters of Genesis are really important. So what we'll do next time, we're a little bit behind schedule, but that's all right. Next time we'll start and we'll take a look at Genesis 10 through 13, and we'll see where that gets us. We'll kind of get to the Tower of Babel, which is a really important story, and then we'll get to the next phase of Genesis. Genesis 12 through 50 is the story of Abraham and his family and the beginnings of God's effort to bless humankind, and we'll see how that story goes.